T to the G, man, who you think it gonna be? And after an overwhelming response on the Migrant reaction video I did, I decided to go down this journey a little further. The title of this one's going to be, It Begins. NYC sends all migrants into poor neighborhoods. Now, before we get into this video, if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. And if you're one of my day ones, you already know what to do. Hit that like button and drop a comment below. Now, without wasting any time, let's get into it.
New York City's migrant crisis continues apace, and the latest data show that 3 of the 5 zip codes with the highest concentration of shelters rank among the city's poorest. These include places...
So it's controversially leaked that New York City's shelters are found overwhelmingly in low-income neighborhoods. Residents of those neighborhoods say it's not fair, especially when rich parts of town like Soho don't have any shelters. But is this really a conspiracy to hurt needy New Yorkers, or is something else going on here?
Police scrambled to hold back the demonstrators. There was screaming and shouting and shoving. Several would be arrested.
47 Hall Street in Clinton Hill has become a focal point of contention for neighbors who say the influx of more than 3,000 asylum seekers living at the site is overwhelming the
3,000
neighborhood.
Now you got droves of people up and down all times of night, no curfew. If they're committing crimes right within themselves, we are fearful that it may spill out into the community.
When the migrants can't work and they're able-bodied and they're sitting around, what are they going to do? Well, many neighborhoods around the city are saying enough's enough. We can't put them up in our neighborhoods.
Demonstrators highlighted a range of concerns, from excess trash to loitering and a surge of homelessness under the BQE among migrants forced to leave the site after their 30-day stay expired.
Let me tell you something, New Yorkers. Never in my life have I had a problem that I did not see an ending to. I don't see an ending to this.
True.
It's official. New York's low-income neighborhoods are where all of its shelters get placed.
Wow.
But what nobody...
I actually didn't even think about that for some reason. I mean, I guess it makes sense if you think about it. Of course, the shelters are going to be in a poor neighborhood. Actually, no, that doesn't make sense. Why are the shelters in poor neighborhoods? Because the rich don't want to see poor people?
Talking about is that even though this sounds incredibly controversial and incredibly unfair, 80% of the city's residents say they support right to shelter, just as long as their neighborhoods don't get the shelters first. And as it turns out, the city's wealthiest residents living in the richest neighborhoods will be the last New Yorkers to ever live near shelters, if the city even decides to build in those parts of town, because something very controversial has been happening ever since this crisis began. Because with busload after busload of asylum seekers arriving in New York from the southern border, New York City quickly ran out of room at its emergency shelters like the Roosevelt Hotel, forcing our leaders, who were surprised by the sheer number of people seeking a free place to stay, to find more emergency shelters as quickly as possible. Because not doing so would be against the laws many New Yorkers say they support. But fascinatingly, the relentless expansion of the asylum industrial complex and its massive shelters hasn't taken place in an evenly distributed manner, with the vast majority of emergency facilities now operating in areas of town that house middle-class and low-income residents, who are now wondering why their neighborhoods are changing while the rich live on the same quiet streets they've always lived on, in neighborhoods that do not show the signs of the out-of-control humanitarian crisis the city's laws mandate its support. But this...
Okay, so you're telling me they have a question of why, because I didn't have a question of why whatsoever. But I'm just more focused on the issue at hand itself. So let me shut what they call the F up and let's get going.
Brings up the real reason why many people are upset over these controversial revelations, asking questions that may have very uncomfortable answers. Like, why is it that the West Village and Soho have 0 shelters for asylum seekers? Why does Queens, the lowest income borough, have the most shelters? And most importantly, could the presence of shelters in some neighborhoods versus others split New Yorkers on how they feel regarding the city's decision to offer unlimited housing to the entire world? Well, as you're about to see, that may very well depend on where you live. So here we are in Midtown Manhattan, one of the city's first neighborhoods to experience a rapid build-out of the shelter system. And right here we have the Stewart Hotel, a former luxury hotel right across the street from Penn Station that now serves as a place for families. But although many of the initial shelters the city set up were in this part of town, after running out of room and having a few shelters get shut down for safety reasons, they turned their attention to other parts of town. And once they started building shelters in other neighborhoods, that's when a lot of this controversy started.
3 of the 5 zip codes with the
Yeah, my question is, Why are they building all these new shelters just for the migrant surge? Like, what about the poor? The poor. What about the homeless people that were there before all this happened? Why weren't they getting a major rush in shelters? That's just the only question I have.
Highest concentration of shelters rank among the city's poorest. These include places like Jamaica in Queens and East New York in Brooklyn.
So to understand why the placement of shelters for asylum seekers has fractured New Yorkers along income lines, we've got to look at just how many of them aren't in expensive parts of town and how many are in low-income neighborhoods. According to the leaked report on shelter locations, Long Island City contains 1 out of every 8 shelters, 23 in total. And in total, the city operates 193 of such facilities. But it doesn't stop there. 3 out of the 5 zip codes in New York that have the lowest incomes also have most of the shelters as well. Areas like Jamaica in Queens and East New York in Brooklyn, where the median annual incomes are around $37,000 a year. Whereas in the West Village.
Wait, I'm sorry. Did you say people are out there making $37,000 a year? How? How? I live in California. If you make $37,000 a year, you're homeless.
Where the average household income is $250,000 a year, you will not find one single shelter. And the same goes for neighboring Soho, which also has 0 shelters and a similar high household income. On top of that, no plans to expand the shelter industrial complex to those neighborhoods that have no shelters in them were revealed as part of this leak, which means the city's richest neighborhoods may never see any shelters ever as long as this crisis continues. But if the right to shelter is something that 80% of New Yorkers say they support, why is it a big deal to have shelters in a given neighborhood?
Migrant shelter at 47 Hall Street in Clinton Hill has become a focal point of contention for neighbors who say the influx of more than 3,000 asylum seekers living at the site is overwhelming the neighborhood, from excess trash to loitering and a surge of homelessness under the BQE among migrants forced to leave the site after their 30-day stay.
Okay, so it's important to understand that these shelters, they can hold anywhere from a few hundred people to thousands of people, depending on how big they are, like the Hall Street shelter in Clinton Hill, Brooklyn. And you've got almost 4,000 people living in a 1-block radius where nobody was living just a couple of years ago because it was all commercial and industrial property. And although neighbors in areas like this are reporting increased crime and unusable parks, that in and of itself is not necessarily a byproduct of the asylum crisis. Because after all, if you were to take 4,000 people who cannot work and have to stay in one location all day, and you put them there, what else would they really do other than hang out at the nearby park? And proponents say that crime goes up whenever population goes up and the police force stays the same size, which is also independent of whether or not people are here seeking asylum. And if you have more people using city resources, won't it be harder to take care of those resources? But what seems unfair to many residents in areas that now have shelters.
Okay, finally, I'm watching somebody do a video and I don't have to say anything because all the facts are just glaringly obvious. Like,
Is that the rich haven't seen any such population increases in their neighborhoods. Their parks all look the same, their neighborhoods all feel the same, and their city resources aren't stretched to the limit. But the reason this seems unfair and weird to so many is because New York is run by politicians who claim that they're looking out for the little guy. Yet it seems to many that the little guy is burdened unfairly by shouldering the cost of policies that affect the entire city, but are localized where they live. While the rich, who also say that they support those policies, aren't doing their fair share to shoulder the burden, which has people asking, do our leaders understand how this is unfairly, in their minds, affecting people of lower incomes? And what are our leaders going to do about this to make it so that everyone does their part?
What we have
all valid questions.
Here is yet another case of a policy created and fought for by progressives, a policy towards migrants that demands they be sheltered, that hands them free food, all while taking up space in neighborhoods where the citizens were already economically hurting, already marginalized.
So this is a very direct critique of what many people say are the problems with how this whole system is happening. But we've got to add something to it, because we're not just looking at progressive policy. We're looking at a progressive policy that is now meeting with reality. And the idea that we're talking about here is that New York City should offer housing to the entire world. But the reality it's being faced with is limited resources, limited money, and limited places places where people can stay. And proponents of how the city's handling this crisis say that that has a lot to do with what shelters are chosen and where they happen to be located. But as you're about to see, this looks and feels like unfairness to residents of neighborhoods that have shelters in them, especially when the rich have no such facilities in their backyards. So this here abandoned husk of a facility, it used to be an emergency shelter that was set up by the city. It's a former college, but the fire department took one look at this place and decided it was unsafe. That's why there's a vacate order on the front door that's about a year old at this point. And the interesting thing about this facility is it's not in a low-income neighborhood. It's actually right down the street from the other hotel in Midtown that is actively a shelter right now. In fact, the former entrance is right over here, and that right there, that is Madison Square Garden. And the reason this is important is because it reveals something about the whole shelter selection process that the city goes through when they find a building. So why was this building ever picked? Well, it's abandoned. It had no purpose, even though it's in an area of town where people have household incomes of around $160,000. And according to a city hall spokesman, locations are chosen as shelters based on how quickly they can be converted and set up. And the first thing this means is not all abandoned buildings are created equal. Some might make better shelters than others. And in the case of this here building, they tried to make it a shelter and it failed, so it didn't work. But the other part of the equation here has to do with saving money. And this building's down the street from other shelters. If it had worked, it would have saved the city money because they've already got security personnel over here. They've already got deliveries from food catering companies. There are caseworkers who deal with asylum claims at various shelters in the area. Everything would be localized to an extent, which reveals that there is some cost savings when you have one shelter next to other shelters. If you want to set up a shelter in a neighborhood that has 0 shelters, all of the infrastructure to run that, all of the caseworkers, all of the food deliveries, everything, you need a new security team. You got to get it all into a new part of town where you don't have any of it before. That could mean that the first shelter in a given neighborhood is the most expensive. And if it is your goal to save money, you line them up one after another, after another, after another, because that's where you have everything set up to run these places. And from a financial standpoint, this makes a lot of sense. The first problem that you have is you need a building nobody wants. And the second problem you have is you need to save money while you're running it, which helps if it's near other buildings nobody wants. And the problem is that the city has been unable to find large swaths of buildings that nobody wants in expensive parts of town. And that explains why you have a lot of shelters, not just here in Midtown, which was decimated by the 2020 remote work revolution, but also over in Long Island City, because a lot of those mega shelters, they're in former buildings that were designated as office space, commercial space. One of them used to be a very large co-working facility. These were not places where you could have actually had apartments. They're not zoned for residential living, but they are places where you could set up an emergency facility. And just like in the case of these bankrupt hotels in Midtown that nobody wanted to stay in after 2020 and were falling into disrepair, the asylum crisis is the best thing to come along and save these industrial structures that now have no use case. But because these places are affordable, it makes it look like the city is actively engaging in income discrimination. They're not trying to spread the resources to care for asylum seekers evenly throughout the city, even though the city evenly says they all support these policies. And it looks like for that reason, reality will continue to dictate that shelters get set up near the shelters we already have, not in neighborhoods that don't have them yet, which is going to make a lot of people upset because the asylum crisis doesn't show any signs of slowing down.
Right. But I'm not gonna lie, he did make a lot of sense though why it's structured that way.
So here we are in the neighborhood south of where that abandoned college and the first hotel we looked at are located. It's called Chelsea, and there are 3 shelters in this neighborhood, but if you look around, it's a pretty historic part of town. It's also a very expensive part of town. Actually, according to the map, it looks like this neighborhood's only got 1 shelter, not 3. And the reason you won't find very many shelters here is because all of the real estate in this neighborhood has already been developed. There used to be old buildings and facilities here that nobody wanted, but those were all torn down to make way for luxury condos. And even though the city was able to put 3 shelters in the neighborhood north of here, if they wanted to add another another one to this neighborhood, I'm not sure where they would find the space for it. Their only conceivable option would be to call this phone number right here on the side of this building and find out a way to buy this empty lot over here where they could probably construct something, but they'd have to do that from scratch. It would be very expensive. And we've learned that the city picks and chooses which buildings become shelters based on how quickly they can be set up, which means they're going to need a pre-existing structure, not an empty lot, but there aren't any more pre-existing structures here. But as it turns out, this has been a problem with how the city has run its homeless shelters even before the asylum crisis started, as the city's homeless shelters were predominantly located in low-income neighborhoods as well. And even though former progressive mayors were aware of this problem and said they had solutions on the table to deal with it, to spread the shelters around more evenly, that never ended up happening. And as you can tell, it still hasn't ended up happening, because if it had, we wouldn't be having this discussion today about why all of the city's asylum shelters aren't located where the rich live. But as you're about to see, this is something many New Yorkers, including those who live in areas that they think have too many shelters, cannot seem to wrap their minds around.
They're committing crimes right within.
I mean, I ain't gonna lie, I didn't understand. That's why I asked in the beginning, but it makes sense from like a financial standpoint.
Themselves, we are fearful that it may spill out into the community.
Despite their grievances, residents are not calling for the shelter to close, but for the city to reduce the number of migrants housed at the shelter.
Take some of the migrants and spread them across Brooklyn. Every area in Brooklyn should be able to hold their fair share of migrants.
So as you can see here, the protesters at the Hall Street shelter, they have no idea why that location was selected, why other locations weren't selected. They have no idea the economics behind why that shelter is as large as it is, and why other parts of town are shelterless for the most part.
My question is, how come nobody explains that to somebody, or maybe their local? I don't know I don't know what unions they have like that for the citizens in New York. I know our local unions are, what do we have in California? But I would think that they would actually have somebody to be like, yo, this is the reason. Like, so you're not just protesting in the streets.
But even though the protesters want every single neighborhood in Brooklyn to have its fair share of shelters, their demands are fascinating, because the demand they're making on the city just isn't realistic. They want every single neighborhood to have the exact same number of shelters. Yet the city has no ability to put shelters in places where there aren't buildings that are for sale or for rent. And observers say that these and many other New Yorkers are upset because they support policies that are somewhat unrealistic, housing the entire world for as long as it might want to come and stay here for 30 days, while at the exact same time not recognizing the infrastructure commitment that has to be there in advance for such a request to be carried out the same way in every single neighborhood. And that's what's got people so riled up. A policy they support has impacted their neighborhood in a way that they do not support. Yet they see other neighborhoods like this one that we're in right now that look and remain unscathed as far as they're concerned. And the thing that they really are alarmed about is that the city's new plans to build new shelters don't include places like this where there are no buildings. Is that why New Yorkers have a problem with the distribution of shelters right now? Is it fair for New Yorkers to say that they support right to shelter, but then be upset when right to shelter actually happens and when it's carried out? And the big question is, if we're going to have right to shelter, the first shelter has to go somewhere. How could you be upset if that's your neighborhood? Eventually, there may be shelters in every single part of town, but we don't know that yet. What do you think's going on here? Do you think people are right?
Bars. All right. Well, I think I got my answer to some of the migrant problem questions. Not all, very far away from all the answers. But from a financial standpoint, it did make sense about what's going on with the housing shelters that they have in New York. But as far as what's going to happen because of this, or what's going to happen in the future, what's going to keep happening, I don't know. Like Mayor Eric Adams said, this does seem to be like a problem that doesn't have an end in sight. So we're still going to be down the rabbit hole trying to hit on points of angles to make this make sense somehow. And if you made it this far, that means you put some paint where it ain't. And for that, you need to be thanked. Don't forget to leave a like, comment, subscribe, share to be aware, put me in that algorithm because I need to be there, man. Because I know there's 10 other streamers out there doing it like me, but fuck that little 10. I'm maxed out.